Hey everyone, welcome back to Double Helix Blueprint of Nations. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are starting a new series today, and I am excited to bring you what I believe to be one of the more important stories that no one has heard about or is often misunderstood. To begin, here's a question. What's the worst thing you can imagine? Think of the worst thing that could happen to you. Maybe some of you listening already had that misfortune be part of your life. Well, the story that I'm about to tell you over the next four episodes begins in a place where the worst thing you can imagine was just Tuesday or Wednesday or just another day of your never ending week. The place I'm talking about is called Saint-Domingue in the 1700s. You probably know it as Haiti. Before it became the first black republic in history, before it became the only successful slave revolution ever, it was called Saint-Domingue. And Saint-Domingue was hell. And I'm not just saying that metaphorically. I'm not exaggerating. In fact, I'm probably not going to be able to be descriptive enough, to be honest. If you were black in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, your only opinion of the place was, as Shakespeare said in The Tempest, that hell is empty and all the devils are here. The French colony was the example of an actual, systematic, calculated hell that produced more wealth than any other place on the planet at the time. Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the world. It was more profitable than all 13 American colonies combined. It produced 40% of the world's sugar and 60% of its coffee. And it was built in a system so brutal, so horrifying, that the average enslaved person who arrived there was dead within 7 years. In fact, the entire slave population would turn over every 20 years or so, and some historians even estimated that within a year, 50% of newly arrived enslaved people would die. And all of this death, it was not from old age, from disease, it was from being worked to death. And that's exactly how the colonizers liked it. You see, everyone knew. The plantation owners knew. The French government knew. Merchants in Paris sipping coffee knew. They all knew exactly how their wealth was being produced, and they just kept going because the math worked. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy new ones than to keep them alive. Plain and simple. As I said, we are doing this series because I believe Haiti is perhaps the most important story that nobody tells you in school. We, of course, learn about the American Revolution, which was in essence a bunch of property-owning white men who didn't want to pay taxes. We also learn about the French Revolution, which conveys images of the masses converging on the streets of Paris, but was driven by middle-class people demanding more rights. But the Haitian Revolution? It was the only time enslaved people successfully overthrew their masters, defeated 3 European empires, and created an independent nation. What do we know about it? Not much. And I think that's because Haiti's success terrified the Western world. It proved that all that Enlightenment talk about natural racial hierarchies was bullshit. It also proved that enslaved people could beat the most powerful militaries on earth. As a result, the world punished them for it for the next 2 centuries and never forgot about it. So over the next 4 episodes, we'll see how Haiti's revolutionary victory became its curse, how winning your freedom could end up bankrupting a nation for generations, how the only successful slave revolution became, at least in the eyes of the Western world, a cautionary tale about what happens when enslaved people dare to be free. Today, we start with the nightmare. You cannot understand the revolution without understanding what made it necessary. And you cannot comprehend the violence of the uprising without comprehending the violence of the system that it destroyed. I will be explicit about torture, rape, and murder. Not to shock, but because this brutality is the DNA that will shape Haiti for centuries to come. As always, before we start, if you're enjoying the show that dives into the DNA of nations, please rate or review the podcast wherever you listen. Tell a friend, a coworker, or a family member. Remember that reviews really help others find the show, so if you have 30 seconds, again, I would really appreciate it and it would be awesome. You can also send us feedback directly over email or through social media, and I am hoping to be able to dedicate more time to our online presence in the near future. And hopefully, it gets the show out to more of you. All right, let's go to 1789, to the richest colony in the world, to a place where 500,000 people lived in hell so that Paris could have sugar in its coffee. We are in the Breda plantation in the northern province of Saint-Domingue at 4:47 a.m. It is August of 1788. In 13 minutes, the plantation bell will ring and 500 enslaved people will begin another day of work that has a statistically significant chance of killing them. But right now, in these last minutes of darkness, a 45-year-old coachman named François Dominique Toussaint is awake. He's always awake before the bell. He uses this time to think. Toussaint can read, unusual for an enslaved person, and potentially dangerous. He's been reading everything he can get his hands on: philosophy, military strategy, history. His owners think he's loyal. He is the manager's right hand, trusted with the horses, allowed small privileges that other enslaved people are not. But in his mind, Toussaint is doing calculations. Not the kind his masters do. How many hogsheads of sugar per acre? How many Africans to replace the ones who died this month? Different mathematics. He is calculating how long a system can sustain itself when it kills its labor force faster than it can replace them. He is calculating what happens when news of revolution in France, all the talk of liberty and equality, reaches people who have nothing left to lose. He is calculating the breaking point of human endurance. Toussaint doesn't know it yet, but in 3 years, he'll be leading the largest slave rebellion in history. In 7 years, he'll command armies. In 12 years, he'll effectively rule this entire colony. And his calculations? They are going to reshape not just Haiti, but the entire architecture of slavery and race in the Atlantic world. This is part 1 of the Haitian curse. Welcome to hell. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Before we dive into our story, we need to understand what Saint-Domingue actually was in 1789. Not just that it was wealthy, that's too simple. We need to grasp the sheer scale of what was happening here because the numbers themselves are an indictment. This single colony, roughly the size of Maryland, was producing more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined. While the United States was just beginning its experiment in democracy, this island was generating wealth that dwarfed the entire American economy. It accounted for 2/3 of France's overseas trade. 40% of the world's sugar came from Saint-Domingue and 60% of its coffee. Paris, that beautiful city where philosophers debated Enlightenment ideas in cafes, was built on Caribbean sugar. The French Navy that would soon defend revolutionary principles across the world was funded by plantation profits. Printing presses, publishing declarations of human rights, purchased with money extracted from the bodies of Saint-Domingue. But here's the dark mathematics that made this wealth possible. Saint-Domingue's prosperity wasn't built on sustainable labor. It was built on a system of consumption. It was calculated consumption of human beings. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person arriving in Saint-Domingue was 7 years. Not from disease alone, not from climate, but from work. From a business model that treated people as renewable resources to be used up and replaced. Between 1783 and 1791, Saint-Domingue imported roughly 40,000 enslaved Africans every single year. That was the cost of an economic system that had calculated death into its profit margins. So when we talk about the Haitian Revolution, we're not talking about people who were merely oppressed. We're talking about people living in what was essentially an industrial death machine disguised as plantation economy. A machine so brutal and so systematically deadly that it made death in rebellion seem like a rational choice. Let me take you to a harbor and show you where all that wealth was flowing. We are in Le Cap Français in Saint-Domingue on April 1789. The light at this hour turns the harbor gold. If you stand there on the main dock and the scene before you looks like prosperity incarnate. 36 ships at anchor, their holds being filled with hogsheads of sugar and coffee that will sell in Bordeaux for prices that make men's eyes widen. Merchants in fine linen coats negotiate cargo manifests, their French accented with Caribbean cadence. The smell of the harbor is expensive. Molasses, coffee, mahogany, indigo. But if you turn your head and you look on the next dock, there is a different kind of cargo that's being processed. It is a slave ship that has arrived 3 days ago from the Bight of Benin. Surviving Africans, perhaps 280 of the 400 that left Africa, are being refreshed before auction. That means washing, oiling their skin to make them look healthier, forcing them to exercise so they don't look too weak from the Middle Passage. A French doctor named Dubois walks among them, checking teeth, examining joints, looking for signs of disease that might affect the sale price. He's not looking for their humanity. He's only looking for their market value. These are the calculations of this hellscape. This one person might fetch 1,200 livres. The one only 800 because he has a limp. A woman may be going for 1,500 because she looks strong enough to survive at least a few years in the fields. The juxtaposition is deliberate, almost architectural. You can't have one dock without the other. The wealth loading onto those merchant ships comes directly from the bodies being unloaded from the slave ship. The system makes no attempt to hide this. And why would it? Everyone knows how prosperity is made here. The whole point is that everyone knows and no one stops it. The harvest season in Saint-Domingue runs from January through June, and it's when the death rate spikes. Understanding why requires understanding how sugar is actually produced because the brutality isn't incidental, is built into the process itself. Sugar cane must be processed within 24 hours of cutting or the juice ferments and becomes unusable. That means that from the moment harvest begins, The entire plantation becomes a non-stop factory. Day shifts, night shifts, no breaks, and no rest days. The cane cutters work 16-hour days in the tropical heat. The boiling house operates around the clock, temperatures inside exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And the mill? It never stops grinding. This isn't because the plantation owners are cartoonishly evil. It is because the economics demand it. If you stop the mill, you lose product. You lose product, you lose money. So the work continues until the harvest ends, and the human cost of that continuity is calculated into the business model as acceptable. We are in the Breda plantation, the northern province, in October of 1789. François Dominique Toussaint, the coachman from our opening, stands near the sugar mill, ostensibly checking on the horses but actually watching the field workers. He is 46 years old now, trusted enough to move relatively freely around the plantation, and he's been doing more calculations. 200 people cutting cane in the fields before him. Approximately 40 of them are new arrivals from Africa this year, replacements for the 40 who died last year. The plantation doesn't grow. It consumes and replaces. The work looks rhythmic from a distance. Hundreds of machetes rising and falling in rough synchronization. But up close, you see the reality. Hands wrapped in rags that are already soaked with blood from the cuts. Bodies bent for hours under the tropical sun. Overseers walking among them with whips ready, not really to punish specific infractions, but just to maintain the pace. The violence isn't exceptional, it's just maintenance here. If you follow one of the cutters, his name is Macandal. He's been in Saint-Domingue for 4 years, which means, statistically, he has 3 years left. After 16 hours cutting cane, Macandal's shift moves to the boiling house. Inside, enslaved workers stripped to the waist feed cane juice into massive copper kettles heated over roaring fires. The juice must be reduced to crystals through a precise sequence of boiling, ladling, and cooling. It's dangerous work. Exhaustion and the heat combined with molten sugar heated to nearly 250 degrees. A worker named Jean-Pierre has his arm plunged into a kettle. Burns like that usually kill slowly. And over the next few weeks, as infection sets in, he will die. The plantation doctor will note Jean-Pierre's name in his death ledger. Another replacement will need to be ordered from the next slave ship. This is what distinguishes Saint-Domingue from other slave societies in the Americas. In Virginia, South Carolina, plantation owners have economic incentives to keep enslaved people alive. A woman who can bear children represents future labor. A skilled worker represents years of training. There is a twisted logic in the paternalistic slavery that allows Southern planters to tell themselves that they care about their people. In Saint-Domingue, the calculation does not exist. Plantation manager Henry Billard sits in his office in the Breda plantation, going through account books. He's managing the plantation for an absentee owner in Paris, and his job is simple: maximize sugar output and minimize the cost. And the numbers are brutal in their clarity. The cost to keep an enslaved person healthy, enough to work for 20 years, substantial investment in food, medical care, reduced work hours, unacceptable. The cost to work an enslaved person to death in 7 years and buy a replacement, significantly less. And so the Atlantic slave trade is functioning efficiently. New arrivals cost 800 to 1200 livres. The increased sugar output from the working people to death more than covers replacement cost. Billard does not think of himself as cruel, he just thinks of himself as efficient. But economics alone don't maintain a system where 30,000 whites govern 500,000 enslaved people. You need terror, and not occasional violence, but systematic, performative, calculated terror designed to make resistance seem impossible. Public executions are scheduled every 2 weeks in Cap Francais. They are not hidden, the opposite of hidden. Maximum visibility is the point. Every enslaved person in the city is required to attend. This is, as they say, education. Let me take you to one of these executions. We are at the Place d'Armes in Le Cap Francais on June 17, 1790. The heat is already oppressive at 10 a.m. 2,000 people surround a scaffold in the center square. Whites in the shade of the colonnade, free people of color standing separately, and enslaved people forced to watch from the sun-exposed center. 3 men are brought forward, enslaved men from different plantations caught planning an escape. The colonial magistrate, Pierre-François Paget, reads their sentences with practiced authority. The first man, who suggested the escape, will be burned alive, slowly. The execution is designed to last several hours. The second man, who agreed to go, will be broken on the wheel, each limb shattered methodically. The third man, who only listened, will be hanged, then gibbeted at the edge of town as a warning. This is not an aberration. This is the way the system works. When natural authority doesn't exist, you create terror so complete that resistance seems impossible. A young white colonist, Etienne de Courtils, recently arrived from France with his medical degree and Enlightenment ideas, watches with growing horror. He has been here 6 months, long enough to know and understand that the philosophical discussions he had in Paris about human dignity mean nothing here. Long enough to see that torture, not punishment, is just a management technique in Saint-Domingue. There's no need to describe the execution in detail, but Etienne de Courtils will later write. What I witnessed today was not justice. It was theater designed to destroy hope itself. Every scream, every moment of prolonged agony, carefully calibrated to teach the watching enslaved population that death is preferable to rebellion. This is the true face of our prosperity. But Paget and the other colonial administrators understand something that Courtils hasn't grasped. This system of terror is fragile. It works only as long as people fear death more than they hate bondage. And when your system has already made life itself a form of slow death, when the average person can expect to be worked to death within 7 years anyway, the calculation changes. Toussaint stands in the crowd, watching not the execution, but the watchers. He sees their faces, and what he sees isn't fear, it's anger. Cold, focused, accumulating anger. The French have made a calculation error. There's a threshold where demonstrated power becomes demonstrated cruelty, and cruelty generates not fear, but hatred. Every public torture, every casual rape, every child sold away from their mother, all of it creates a shared ledger of grievances so extensive that forgetting becomes impossible. By 1790, Saint-Domingue is 3 societies occupying the same space, each with completely incompatible visions of the future. But that's too simple. The French historian Paul Frégosi captured the real societal reality with brutal precision. Whites, mulattoes, and blacks loathed each other. The poor whites couldn't stand the rich whites. The rich whites despised the poor whites. The middle-class whites were jealous of the aristocratic whites. The whites born in France looked down upon the locally born whites. Mulattoes envied the whites, despised the blacks, and were despised by the whites. Free Negroes brutalized those who were still slaves. Haitian-born blacks regarded those from Africa as savages. Everyone, quite rightly, lived in terror of everyone else. Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich. This wasn't just ethnic division. This was a society along every possible line: race, class, birthplace, wealth, legal status, and critically, these divisions prevented any unified response to the enslaved population's eventual uprising. The Grand Blancs, the big whites, are the plantation owners, maybe 5,000, who control nearly all of the wealth of the island. They read Enlightenment philosophy, toast liberty in Paris, and see no contradiction with owning hundreds of human beings. They want autonomy from France, but maintenance of slavery. The Petit Blanc, the poor whites, are the overseers, the shop owners, maybe 25,000 people whose only advantage over free people of color is their skin. They're the most fanatically committed to racial hierarchy because it's all they have. If you remove that, they're just another poor man in a brutal economy. The free people of color, maybe 28,000, are a paradox. Some own plantations and slaves themselves. Some are educated in France and wealthier than most whites. But they can't vote, hold office, or wear certain clothing. They exist in an impossible middle ground, constantly humiliated despite their wealth. And then there are the roughly 500,000 enslaved people who want something more radical and simple than any of these groups want: freedom, complete, immediate, and unconditional. This pyramid of hatred is about to be tested by a man who thought he could change it through reason and moderate force. Vincent Auger is everything the colonial system claims was impossible. He's a wealthy free man of color who owns coffee plantations and enslaved people. He is educated in Paris, fluent in Enlightenment philosophy, personally acquainted with members of the National Assembly. If anyone could bridge the gap between white supremacy and racial equality, it should be him. But that is precisely why his story matters, because it proved that the gap can't be bridged, not in this system. The system is working exactly as it was designed to do, and the moderate demands for reform will be met with the same violence as revolutionary demands for transformation. Auger had spent months in Paris lobbying the National Assembly, not for abolition, because he's careful to make this clear, not for the liberation of enslaved people, just for equal rights for free people of color, the right to vote, hold office, be treated as citizens rather than threatening intermediate category that complicates racial hierarchies. When the Assembly waffled, issuing ambiguous decrees that satisfied no one, Auger made a fateful decision. He would return to Saint-Domingue and force it issued through armed demonstration. He did not intend revolution, just demonstration, to show the colonial authorities that free people of color had both the organization and the will to claim their rights. He landed secretly in the north with Jean-Baptiste Chevanney and gathered roughly 300 followers, mostly men of color, but also some Petit Blancs sympathetic to their cause. The demands they issued were moderate to the point of conservative. Implement the National Assembly's decree, grant political equality for free people of color, maintain slavery and the plantation system. The colonial authorities' response was swift and merciless. Not because Auger's rebellion was that dangerous. It was composed of 300 poorly armed men who couldn't threaten the colonial military apparatus, because the principle was dangerous. If free people of color could claim equality through force, if moderate demands backed by arms could succeed, the entire racial hierarchy that justified everything else would collapse. The rebellion lasted less than 2 months. Colonial forces backed by Petit Blanc militias eager to demonstrate their loyalty hunted Auger's men through the northern mountains. By December, it was over. Auger and Chevanney fled to Spanish Santo Domingo, where they were captured and returned to French authorities. What happened next was designed to send a message, not just to the free people of color, but to everyone watching. We are once again in Cap Français at Place d'Armes on February 25th of 1791. The execution of Vincent Auger and Jean-Baptiste Chevanet is scheduled for maximum visibility. Every free person of color in Cap Français is required to watch. The enslaved population is brought in to witness what happens to those who challenge the racial order. Even the Grand Blancs turn out, treating it like a social event once again. The method chosen is breaking on the wheel, the same technique reserved for the worst criminals and rebellious slaves. The symbolism is deliberate. Auger might have been wealthy and have education, but in the eyes of colonial law, is no different from any other person of color who forgets their place. The executioner breaks Auger's limbs methodically. It takes hours. They use an iron bar while he's still conscious. Between each blow, the magistrate reads charges: rebellion against lawful authority, conspiracy to overthrow the racial order, attempting to claim rights reserved for whites only. What the colonial authorities don't understand, what they can't understand because their worldview won't allow it, is that they're not suppressing rebellion. They're teaching everyone watching that moderate demands will be met with the same brutality as revolutionary ones, that there is no path to reform within the system, that if you're going to challenge the racial hierarchy, you might as well go all the way. If Vincent Auger, wealthy, educated, moderate in his demands, willing to preserve slavery, can be broken on the wheel for asking for political equality, what hope is there for peaceful change? What possibility exists for reform that doesn't require destroying the entire system? The answer is clear: none. Within 6 months, Northern Province will explode in coordinated rebellion. Auger's execution didn't prevent the uprising, it accelerated it. By demonstrating that the colonial system would rather destroy itself than reform, the authorities made revolution the only rational choice. The Free Colors' petition for equal rights has terrified the Petit Blancs. In a tavern in Le Cap, Claude Milot, an overseer, gets drunk and explains the fear. Rights for the mulattoes? Next they'll want rights for the slaves. Then where are we? We'll be driven into the sea. This is the psychological position of the Petit Blancs, the most fanatically committed to racial hierarchy precisely because they have the most to lose from its erosion. Meanwhile, free people of color like Julien Raymond meet in private homes debating strategy. They're arguing for equality while preserving slavery, a logical position given that they own slaves themselves. But they're watching the same mathematics play out as Toussaint. The system, as currently constituted, cannot last. Within months, some of these men will lead the first colored rebellion. Within 2 years, some will be fighting along Toussaint. The middle ground that they're trying to occupy is about to disappear. News spread through the plantation faster than the masters realized. Enslaved people have information networks that whites don't see. Conversations between coachmen, messages passed through market vendors, songs with coded meaning, religious ceremonies where information flows in hidden ritual. By early 1791, everyone knows about France, about revolution, about the Declaration of the Rights, about liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the slave quarters of the Bredat plantation, people discuss what they've heard, some accurate, much distorted through multiple retellings, but the core message is clear. In France, the social order is being challenged. All hierarchies are falling. Do these rights apply to us? Someone asked. Toussaint has read the actual declaration. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Not French men, not white men, men. Either words mean something or they don't. An older man named Macandal says quietly, "The French will have to choose between their principles and their profits, between liberty for all or just liberty for them." What none of them know yet is that France is about to try to have it both ways. The rights of man apply to free people of color, they'll decide, but not enslaved people. Property rights trumps human rights. This hedging will destroy Saint-Domingue. You can't have half-free people. You can't declare universal rights that stop at certain skin tones. The enslaved people are about to call that bluff. By mid-1791, the planning has been going on for months. Secret meetings in the mountains. Information passed through voodoo ceremonies where religious rituals provide cover for political organizing. The leaders are emerging. Boukman, the man Toussaint noticed, the one who looked at the overseer and made him stop, Georges Bissot, Jean-Francois, and dozens of others whose name history won't record. The challenge is going to be timing. If they strike too early, you get crushed. If they strike too late, the moment passes. The coordination has to be perfect. We are now in a forest clearing in Bois Caïman on August 14, 1791. The clearing in the forest is carefully chosen. It is hidden, accessible from multiple plantations, defensible. Between 100 and 200 people have gathered here, having come in small groups to avoid suspicion. Boukman speaks in Creole. The God of the whites tells them to commit crimes, but our God tells us to seek vengeance. He will guide our arms. A woman, historical accounts argue about her identity, becomes possessed by the Iwa, the spirits. In this altered state, she speaks prophecy. The time is now. The spirits support the rebellion. A pig is sacrificed. Blood is drunk, binding the conspirators to each other. Oaths are sworn, and the date is set. 1 week from tonight, August 21st. The northern province will rise simultaneously, every plantation, all at once. This moment has been building for centuries. From the first African force onto a slave ship, through the systematic brutality of Saint-Domingue, through the casual torture that's made life unbearable, all pushing towards this moment. The calculations have finally tipped. Death in rebellion is preferable to life in bondage. At 10 p.m. on August 21st, 1791, the northern province of Saint-Domingue explodes into coordinated rebellion. It is not spontaneous. It is not disorganized. It is the result of weeks of careful planning, executed across hundreds of plantations simultaneously. Enslaved people rise up against overseers, managers, and owners. They're armed with machetes, axes, whatever tools they can seize. Within hours, flames light up the night sky as sugar plantations burn. And within days, 1,000 plantations are destroyed. Within weeks, the richest colony in the world is a war zone. The white colonists are caught completely by surprise. They thought their system was stable. They thought the divisions between African-born and Creole, between house servant and field workers, between different plantations would prevent unified action. But they were wrong. The violence is extreme, brutal. Plantation owners are killed, overseers are tortured to death with the same methods they used on enslaved people. Entire families are executed. The head of children are mounted on spikes outside of plantations. This horrifies European observers who will use these atrocities to argue that enslaved people are naturally savage, that rebellion proves that they're unfit for freedom. When you build a society on systematic torture, when you normalize brutality, When you demonstrate that might makes right, you cannot be surprised when the oppressed learn that lesson and apply it back. The rebellion's violence is the plantation system's violence turned around. It is not savagery per se, it's a replication. The enslaved people are using the same management techniques that were used on them, the same psychology of terror, the same calculation that visible brutality creates compliance. The difference is, when enslaved people do it, the world calls it barbarism. When plantation owners did it, the world called it commerce. Within 3 weeks, the northern province is under rebel control. Toussaint, who stayed carefully neutral in the rebellion's opening days, is watching and evaluating. He sees the tactical victories, but also the strategic problems. The rebels are winning battles, but not building institutions. They're destroying the plantation system, but not creating anything to replace it. In 3 months, he'll join the rebellion. In 3 years, he'll be leading it. In 13 years, he'll have transformed a slave revolt into a revolutionary state, negotiated with 3 European empires, and made Saint-Domingue briefly free. Tonight, August 21st, 1791, what matters is that the calculation has finally tipped. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue have chosen death, fighting over death, working. They've chosen rebellion over submission. They've chosen to burn down hell rather than live in it another day. The nightmare that made revolution inevitable, that was the plantation system. The revolution itself will become the bill coming due. You cannot understand what happens next. The fury, the violence, the totality of the vengeance and the revolution without understanding what came before. You cannot understand why compromise proved impossible without seeing the system that made compromise morally intolerable. Saint-Domingue didn't just have slavery. It had industrial slavery. Slavery designed for maximum profit extraction with zero regard for human life. Slavery that calculated death into its business model. Slavery that required such extreme terror to maintain that it created the exact conditions for revolutionary explosion. When Toussaint and the other revolutionary leaders say they're fighting for liberty, they mean something different than what Washington or Robespierre meant. They're fighting for recognition of their humanity, fighting against a system that literally worked them to death for profit, fighting against the idea that some humans can be property of other humans. Next time, on Double Helix, Toussaint Louverture transforms a slave rebellion into a revolutionary state-building project. We'll see how former slaves defeat not just France, but Spain and Britain too. How the revolution navigates impossible contradictions, maintaining a plantation economy while abolishing slavery, building a nation while fighting 3 empires, claiming Enlightenment ideals while the Enlightenment itself rejects them. We'll watch Toussaint maneuver between colonial powers, create a constitution, rebuild an economy devastated by war, and ultimately discover that revolutionaries who succeed become targets for everyone who fears what their success represents. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.